Bentley's tire screamed against the highway before it slammed into the oak tree. Flames rising fast, and no one around, except a poor little girl selling jam by the roadside. What she did next not only saved a billionaire's life, but uncovered a secret that would change both their worlds forever. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs hope today, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. The morning sun poured across Highway 41 like a painter spilling gold onto a canvas, each streak lighting up the dew that clung to wild grasses at the roadside. A quiet stillness lay over the land, broken only by the occasional rush of a commuter's car slicing through the early haze. In front of a weathered cottage, a little girl knelt on the edge of the road, her small hands working with a kind of sacred precision. Amelia Carter, just 7 years old, lined up mason jars of strawberry jam along a handmade wooden stand. Each jar glowed red in the sunlight, as if holding tiny fragments of dawn inside them. She adjusted the labels carefully, tugged the twine bows straighter, and then stepped back to admire the display. To her, it wasn't just jam, it was treasure, something that could catch the eye of a stranger, something that might make them smile, and maybe, just maybe, help her grandmother pay the week's bills. "Don't forget the price tags, Amelia," came the familiar call from the porch. Her grandmother Mabel sat in her rocking chair, needles clicking gently as she worked on a scarf that would never quite be finished. Mabel's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had raised a child once before and was now raising another, though her bones ached and her lungs often protested. "Already done, Grandma," Amelia chirped back, her curls bouncing as she skipped over to show off the neat little numbers she'd written. She wasn't like other children who hid behind their mother's skirts when strangers came near. Amelia met eyes boldly, spoke with a confidence that startled grown-ups, and sold with a smile that made people buy an extra jar whether they needed it or not. Mabel often wondered if her granddaughter had inherited her late mother's fire or if it was born out of necessity. As the sun climbed higher, the trickle of cars slowed, and the stand grew quiet. Amelia gathered bottle caps from the roadside, a hobby that puzzled the neighbors but filled her with delight. Each cap was polished clean, sorted by color, and arranged into elaborate shapes she called treasure maps. She claimed they led to magical places, castles made of jam, forests of candy canes, and hidden caves filled with rubies. Her favorite cap, a deep crimson one with a glint that caught every ray of light, she held up like a sacred jewel. "This one," she told her grandmother, "is the most important of all. It's going to change everything someday." Mabel smiled, though her heart ached. She saw in that little cap the fragile dreams of a child who had already lost too much. Amelia's mother, Rebecca, had died giving her life, leaving the girl with only a photograph and stories passed down in whispers. Mabel had stepped in as both parent and protector, shielding Amelia from the world's sharper edges, but she knew her time was running thin. "Maybe it will, sweetheart," Mabel said softly. "Maybe it will." The afternoon passed in quiet rhythm. The humming of bees, the creak of Mabel's rocking chair, the patter of Amelia's bare feet as she rearranged her treasure maps again and again. To anyone driving past, the cottage looked ordinary, but within its peeling walls and around its little jam stand, love wrapped itself around the child like a shield. Neither of them knew that by tomorrow the crimson bottle cap would no longer be just a trinket. That fate was already racing toward them on 4 gleaming wheels and a thunderous engine. That the tiny world Amelia and Mabel had built from jam jars and hope was about to collide with something vast, dangerous, and forever life-changing. And so the day ended, as most days did, with Amelia lying awake in her small room, bottle caps spread around her like stars in a private constellation. She whispered to her ruby cap, "Bring me something magical." She could never have imagined that the magic would arrive not in a treasure chest, but in the smoke and fire of a burning Bentley, and in the man whose life she would save. The next afternoon was warm, the kind of summer heat that clung to the air and made the pavement shimmer. Amelia sat cross-legged in the grass by the roadside, her tongue poking from the corner of her mouth as she arranged her bottle caps into a winding pattern that looked, in her mind, like a secret map leading to a hidden kingdom. Each cap was a landmark. The silver ones marked rivers, the green ones were forests, and at the center, she placed the crimson ruby, gleaming in the sunlight like the heart of all her imagined worlds. She was humming to herself, a tune her grandmother often played on the old piano in the cottage when the tranquility shattered. Tires screeched in the distance, sharp, high, and desperate. Amelia's head snapped up. She saw it then, a black Bentley, polished like obsidian, barreling down Highway 41. It swerved violently as a deer leapt across the asphalt. The animal vanished into the trees, but the car spun out of control. Time seemed to slow. The Bentley tore across the gravel shoulder, its tires spitting stones like bullets, and slammed into the great oak tree that had stood for generations at the edge of their land. The sound was thunderous, a bone-deep crunch of metal against wood. Birds exploded from the branches above, wings scattering against the blazing sky. For a heartbeat, silence held. Then came the hiss of steam and the sinister glow of orange flames curling from beneath the crumpled hood. "Grandma!" Amelia cried, but her legs were already moving. She sprinted across the grass, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Through the shattered windshield she saw him, a man slumped forward in a gray suit, his forehead streaked with blood, his body limp against the seatbelt. He looked like someone from another world, polished and powerful, but in that moment, he was just a man trapped in a burning cage. Amelia pounded on the driver's side, it didn't budge. The handle stuck. The metal groaned and shifted as the fire licked higher. Smoke poured through the cracks, stinging her eyes, filling her lungs. Panic clawed at her chest, but something inside her, something that had been trained by years of hearing her grandmother's steady voice, snapped her back to clarity. She grabbed a jagged rock from near the tree and swung it with both hands against the passenger window. The glass cracked, spider-webbing across the surface. She swung again, harder, until the pane gave way with a sharp explosion of shards. Safety glass rained across the seat like ice. Without hesitation, Amelia climbed halfway through the broken opening, her small arms reaching for the man. "Mister, wake up! The car's on fire!" Her voice carried a command far larger than her size. She shook his shoulder, and his eyes fluttered open, dazed and confused. He coughed, choking on the smoke, but her voice cut through his fog. "You have to move, now!" His trembling fingers fumbled with the seatbelt. Amelia tugged, guiding him toward her. The flames roared louder, eating at the engine, heat pressing against their skin. With a final push, he slid across the seat, and together they tumbled out of the window onto the grass. They crawled, coughing, dragging themselves farther from the wreck. Behind them, the Bentley gave a terrible groan, then exploded in a burst of fire and sound. The shockwave knocked Amelia flat, her ears ringing, the world spinning. She forced herself up on shaky elbows and looked at the man beside her. His chest heaved, his face streaked with ash and blood, but he was alive. "You're going to be okay," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling. She believed it, and in that belief there was power. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each second. Amelia reached into her pocket and felt the familiar ridges of her crimson bottle cap. She pulled it out, studying its glow in the firelight. Without saying a word, she slipped it into the man's jacket pocket. "For luck," she whispered. And as the paramedics' lights cut across the smoky sky, the man turned his head just enough to look at her. Confusion clouding his gaze, but gratitude flickering like a fragile flame behind it. Amelia held his eyes. A little girl who had no idea that in saving him, she had set fire to the course of both their destinies. The sterile white ceiling blurred above him as Alexander Stone blinked awake, his head heavy and wrapped in bandages. The muffled beeping of machines pressed against his foggy thoughts, each tone reminding him that he was alive, though he could not yet piece together why. The last clear image he held was of flames swallowing his Bentley, heat clawing at his lungs, and then eyes. Dark, determined eyes of a child who had shouted at him with the authority of a general and pulled him toward life. He shifted, wincing as pain shot down his ribs. A nurse appeared, her shoes soft against the polished floor. "Mr. Stone," she said gently, adjusting his IV line. "You've been very lucky." He wanted to laugh at that, but his throat was raw, his voice hoarse. Lucky was not a word he'd ever needed. Fortune bent to him. His empire was built on bending chance to his will. Yet here he was, alive because of something outside of his control, because of someone. Dr. Patricia Hoffman entered with a clipboard pressed to her chest, her expression too serious for comfort. She was a woman who chose her words with care, and Alexander's instincts as a billionaire used to negotiations stirred uneasily. "Your concussion is mild, though you'll need rest," she began. "But there's something unusual we need to discuss." He tensed. "Is there a problem with my recovery?" "Not with your recovery," she said slowly, "but with what we discovered during your intake." She pulled a paper from the clipboard, sliding it across the tray beside his bed. "As part of a regional genetic study, we ran your blood sample through the database. It flagged an unexpected correlation." Alexander's brows furrowed. "What kind of correlation?" Dr. Hoffman looked him straight in the eye. "A parent-child relationship, strong, nearly conclusive." For a moment, the room tilted, the sound of the monitors receding into silence. His hand gripped the bed rail until his knuckles whitened. "That's impossible. I don't have children." "The child's name is Amelia Carter," Hoffman said softly. 7 years old. She was admitted briefly to this hospital once before after a fall at school. The records match. The correlation is undeniable. Her name landed like a hammer blow. Amelia. The name tugged at a memory he didn't know he had, a thread pulling him toward recognition. He saw her again in his mind, the small figure dragging him from fire, the steady voice declaring he would be okay, the tiny hand slipping something into his pocket before sirens arrived. His mind reeled. Amelia Carter? His voice cracked on the last word. "Yes," Hoffman confirmed. Her mother was Rebecca Carter, maiden name, Thompson. The sound of that name tore through him like lightning. Rebecca. He was no longer in the hospital but standing on a college lawn years ago, sunlight in her hair, her laughter carrying across the quad. They had planned a future together, travel, children, building something that would last. And then, just after graduation, she was gone. A short note, no explanation beyond needing her own path. He had buried his hurt under work, smothering grief and ambition, never knowing she had carried with her a piece of his life he would never get back. She died, Hoffman continued quietly, in childbirth, 7 years ago. Alexander's heart stopped, then started again with violent force. Rebecca had been pregnant with his child. Amelia wasn't just the girl who saved his life, she was his daughter. He pressed his hands over his face, breath ragged. Images collided. Rebecca smiling through candlelight, Amelia's fierce little eyes, the crimson bottle cap he'd found in his jacket pocket when they stripped away the ruined suit. Fate had drawn a cruel, perfect circle. Dr. Hoffman spoke again, her tone cautious. "There's more you should know. Amelia's guardian, her grandmother, has been receiving treatment here. Advanced pancreatic cancer. Her prognosis is..." She trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. The walls of Alexander's empire seemed to crumble in that moment. His world of mergers and boardrooms meant nothing against this truth. He had a daughter who had saved him without knowing who he was, and now she was in danger of losing the only parent she'd ever known. He lowered his hands, eyes burning with something he hadn't felt in years. Fear, sorrow, longing all tangled into one. "I need to see the results myself," he whispered. "You will," Hoffman promised. "But Mr. Stone, you should also prepare yourself. This will change everything." As she left the room, Alexander lay motionless, staring at the ceiling once more. Except now, the sterile white above him felt like a canvas waiting for him to make a choice. He could return to his old life of power and detachment, or he could step into a new one, where a small girl with a crimson bottle cap had already decided for him. For the first time in years, Alexander Stone wasn't thinking about deals or profits. He was thinking about a daughter. Alexander Stone sat upright in the hospital bed long after Dr. Hoffman left, his body aching but his mind refusing to rest. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above him, each flicker pulling him deeper into memories he had spent years burying under schedules and contracts. Rebecca's name pulsed in his thoughts, heavy as a drumbeat. He hadn't spoken it aloud in nearly a decade, yet the sound of it was enough to reopen wounds he thought had scarred over. He remembered the first time he saw her, college campus in autumn, a crisp wind scattering leaves across the stone steps. She had been arguing with the professor about philosophy, her voice bright and certain, daring anyone to tell her she was wrong. He'd been captivated, not just by her beauty, but by the fire in her words. Rebecca Thompson didn't bend easily, and in those years, she became the only person who ever challenged Alexander's relentless pursuit of more. He had been hungry even then, devouring internships, chasing investments, skipping meals for meetings, already dreaming of skyscrapers that would one day bear his name. But she had slowed him down, reminded him to laugh, to look at the stars instead of just the numbers. They had stayed up late in the library, whispering plans about the future. She wanted to travel, to teach, to create something that mattered beyond profit. He wanted to conquer, to own, to build a fortress no one could tear down. Somewhere between those long nights and stolen mornings, they had promised each other everything. Marriage, a home, a family. He'd even bought a modest ring, hidden in the back of his desk drawer, waiting for the right moment. But graduation came with a cruel twist. One morning she was there, radiant in her cap and gown, pressing his hand and telling him she believed in him. The next day she was gone, leaving nothing but a folded note in his apartment mailbox. Ed to find my own path. No explanation, no fight, no chance to argue. He had read the note until the paper tore at the creases, anger and heartbreak eating at him until he drowned them in work. Now, years later, the truth unfolded with brutal clarity. She hadn't left to chase dreams alone. She had left because she carried his child, their child, Amelia. Alexander pressed his palms to his eyes, breathing hard. All the endless nights in boardrooms, all the deals sealed with ruthless precision, and all along he had been missing the one thing that mattered most. Rebecca had borne their daughter in silence, suffered, and died bringing her into the world, and he had never even known. The sterile smell of antiseptic faded, replaced by the phantom memory of Rebecca's perfume, light and floral. He imagined her sitting across from him now, her eyes steady and sad. "You were too consumed," she might have said. "You would have resented me. I couldn't risk that for her." He wanted to argue with the ghost, to scream that she had been wrong, but deep down he knew there was truth in her fear. At 25, he had been relentless, consumed by ambition so fierce it scorched everything in its path. Would he have welcomed fatherhood then, or would he have seen it as a chain? Shame wrapped around him like a shroud, yet beneath it, something else stirred, resolve. Amelia wasn't a memory, wasn't a regret carved into the past. She was alive, a 7-year-old girl with her mother's courage and his stubbornness, a child who had already saved his life without even knowing she was tied to him. He reached into the pocket of his hospital robe, fingers brushing the rough edge of something small and metallic. Pulling it out, he stared at the crimson bottle cap she had pressed into his suit jacket. It sat in his palm, scratched and ordinary, yet it gleamed as if lit from within. Her gift, her says, and a piece of her belief in magic. For Alexander Stone, who had spent his life measuring everything in returns and margins, the bottle cap felt like the most valuable thing he had ever owned. The thought hit him with force. Rebecca had trusted her mother to raise Amelia, but that chapter was closing. The doctor's words about Mabel's failing health echoed like thunder. Soon Amelia would need someone else, someone permanent, someone who would stay. Alexander closed his fist around the cap, his decision crystallizing in the silence of the hospital room. He could not rewrite the past, but he could choose the future. He could step into the role he had once been too blind to see. His chest rose and fell with a tremor he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, Alexander Stone, the man the world called ruthless, untouchable, felt both fear and hope crash together inside him. He was no longer just a billionaire with an empire. He was a father, and tomorrow he would begin proving it. The cottage door creaked open with a weary sigh, and Alexander Stone stood on the threshold, his expensive shoes sinking slightly into the worn welcome mat. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla floated out to meet him, carrying with it the echo of a life so different from his own polished world of glass towers and boardrooms. Inside, the air felt warm but heavy, as though every wall carried the weight of decades of secrets. Mabel Carter appeared in the doorway, her frail frame wrapped in a faded cardigan, the knitting needles she always seemed to carry resting uselessly in her lap. Her eyes, sharp despite the shadows beneath them, met his with an expression that surprised him. Not shock, not fear, but recognition, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. "Mr. Stone," she said quietly, her voice steady but softened by age. "I wondered how long it would take you." The words struck him harder than he expected. He had braced for denial, anger, accusations. Instead, she opened the door wider and stepped aside, gesturing him in. He crossed the threshold, feeling the shift as though he were leaving one universe and entering another. The living room was modest, its furniture faded from years of use. A crocheted blanket lay across the back of a couch that sagged in the middle. On the refrigerator in the corner, drawings were taped in a chaotic rainbow, stick figures, cottages, trees, treasure maps made from colored bottle caps glued to paper. His chest tightened as his eyes traveled over each piece, every stroke of crayon speaking of the child he had not known, but who had somehow known him enough to save his life. "You knew," he said finally, his voice rough. "Even at the accident, you knew who I was." Mabel lowered herself into a chair, her hands folded together with effort. "Rebecca made me promise. She said I should only contact you if something happened to me. Until then, Amelia was to be mine to raise." She looked at him with eyes that were unflinching, and I kept that promise. The sound of Rebecca's name in that room twisted the knife in his chest. He lowered himself onto the couch, every inch of him feeling suddenly too large, too foreign in the tiny space. "She should have told me," he whispered, though it came out like an accusation hurled at himself more than at the woman before him. "She believed you weren't ready," Mabel replied gently. "You were building your empire. She didn't want you to see Amelia as a burden." She coughed lightly, covering it with a handkerchief she pulled from her pocket. He noticed the tremor in her hand, the yellowed tinge of her skin, the way her breathing hitched with every sentence. The truth settled over him like smoke. This woman was dying. Her time was measured not in years, but in weeks, perhaps days. And when she was gone, Amelia would be alone unless he stepped forward. "Why didn't you tell her otherwise?" he asked, his voice cracking. Mabel's eyes softened. "Because Rebecca was stubborn and she was afraid. And because once Amelia was placed in my arms, I couldn't bear the thought of letting her go. She became my reason to keep breathing, even as my body gave out." Alexander's gaze drifted again to the walls where Amelia's presence filled every corner. Her drawings, her bottle cap patterns on the coffee table, the faint scent of jam still lingering in the kitchen, a child's world built on scraps and love. His throat burned with the realization that he had missed all of it. Her first words, her first steps, her laughter echoing through these very rooms. "How long do you have?" The question emerged before he could stop it. Mabel didn't flinch. "Weeks, maybe a month if I'm lucky." She folded the handkerchief in her lap, smoothing its edges with delicate care. "I've been trying to prepare her without frightening her, but she's only 7. 7-year-olds shouldn't have to face the world alone." The sound of a door slamming made them both turn. Amelia burst into the room, cheeks flushed from the walk home from school, a paper bag of apples clutched to her chest. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. "It's you!" she exclaimed, rushing forward. "The man from the car! Are you all better now? Did my lucky bottle cap help?" Alexander's heart stuttered. He had faced hostile takeovers, vicious competitors, entire markets collapsing beneath him, but nothing had ever made him feel so unsteady as the sight of this child's joy. "Yes, sweetheart," he managed, his voice husky. "It helped very much." Amelia grinned, then skipped to the table to spread out her apples beside her collection of bottle caps. She began arranging them into a new pattern, humming under her breath. Alexander watched her small fingers move with care, and something inside him shifted irreversibly. In that moment, he understood the full weight of what had been entrusted to him. This was no longer about guilt or regret. It was about a little girl who looked at him with trust shining in her eyes, not knowing yet that he was her father. It was about honoring Rebecca's memory and Mabel's sacrifice. It was about stepping into the role he had once abandoned without even knowing it existed. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Stone silently promised himself that he would not run. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, revealing a corridor of marble and glass that seemed to stretch forever. Amelia clutched her small suitcase with both hands, her knuckles white against the handle, while Alexander guided her forward with a gentleness that belied his reputation. The penthouse loomed above them, 40 floors higher than any place she had ever seen, yet Amelia moved as if walking through a dream, wide-eyed, cautious, unsure if she belonged in a world that smelled faintly of polished wood and wealth. "Welcome home," Alexander said softly, though the words sounded uncertain even to him. He had rehearsed them in his mind, imagining her face lighting up, but now, as she stood frozen in the gleaming hallway, he realized how strange it must all feel. The living room stretched before them like a palace, walls of glass spilling open to the Chicago skyline, sunlight scattering across a lake that shimmered far below. Chandeliers glittered overhead, their crystals catching the light like frozen rain. To Alexander, these details had long ago become ordinary, stripped of wonder. To Amelia, they were overwhelming. She stepped onto the plush carpet, setting her suitcase down as if afraid to disturb it. Her eyes darted to every corner, the towering bookshelves, the grand piano gleaming in one corner, the modern art hanging in frames more expensive than her grandmother's entire cottage. Yet even as she stared, her hand moved instinctively to the pocket of her cardigan where the bottle caps clinked softly, her private anchor in this unfamiliar sea. "Would you like to see your room?" Alexander asked, kneeling so his gaze was level with hers. His tie hung loose, his sleeves rolled, an effort to make himself look less imposing. She nodded, silent but curious. He led her down a hallway, each step echoing faintly. When he opened the door, Amelia hesitated at the threshold. The bedroom glowed in soft blues and yellows, the kind of colors he had been told children liked. A window seat overlooked the city, a shelf had been built especially for her bottle cap collection, and a small desk stood waiting with new art supplies carefully arranged. "This is all mine?" she whispered, barely believing. "Every bit of it," he said. She walked slowly inside, touching the edge of the bedspread as if testing its reality. She placed her suitcase on the carpet and carefully unzipped it, pulling out the shawl her grandmother had given her. Draping it over her shoulders, she sat cross-legged on the bed, hugging the fabric close. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Alexander, standing in the doorway, felt the sharp pang of how foreign he still was to her. That night, after Mrs. Rivera served dinner, Amelia barely touched. Alexander lingered outside her door. From within, he could hear her small voice whispering, perhaps to the bottle caps she arranged on her nightstand, perhaps to her grandmother's memory. He resisted the urge to knock, to tell her everything, to confess that he was her father. Instead, he lowered himself to the floor, back against the wall, keeping vigil like a guard. Sometime after midnight, a sound broke the stillness, a muffled sob. His heart clenched. He pressed his forehead to his knees, realizing no fortune could shield her from grief. He could not replace Mabel, nor erase the ache of absence, but he could be here. He could stay when others had left. As the city lights flickered through the glass walls and the hum of traffic far below whispered of another world, Alexander understood that this was not about palaces or wealth. It was about presence, about showing up in the dark when a child cried, even if all you could do was sit outside her door. Inside, Amelia eventually drifted to sleep, clutching her grandmother's shawl, her bottle caps lined in neat rows beside her. Outside, Alexander Stone remained awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and knowing for the first time in his life that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The idea was born one quiet afternoon, as Amelia sat cross-legged on the penthouse floor with her bottle caps scattered around her like jewels. She hummed while she worked, arranging them into patterns that only she could see. Twisting paths, circles, shapes that seemed like secret constellations waiting to be read. Alexander watched from the couch, the leather beneath him suddenly feeling out of place in the presence of such simple magic. He had seen floor plans for skyscrapers, blueprints for empires, graphs that bent markets to his will, but none of them carried the strange, undeniable power of a child turning discarded scraps into treasure. "What are you making today?" he asked. Amelia looked up, her curls falling across her forehead. "A treasure map," she said with the same certainty she had used when pulling him from the burning Bentley. She pointed to the crimson cap at the center. "This is the ruby. It's where the good things start. You follow the trail and you find a place where kids don't feel sad anymore." The words hit him harder than any boardroom negotiation. A place where kids don't feel sad anymore. It was simple, it was impossible, and yet it was exactly what he realized he wanted to create. That evening he spread papers across the long dining table, the surface usually reserved for rare dinners with investors. Amelia wandered in, curious, dragging her shawl behind her. "What's all this?" she asked. "An idea," Alexander replied, his pen resting on a legal pad. "What if we started something together? A foundation, a way to help children who don't have enough. Food, art supplies, a place to feel safe." Amelia's eyes lit up. "Like treasure maps for everyone?" He smiled. "Exactly, but I think you should help me decide what goes in those treasure maps." She climbed into the chair opposite him, her small legs swinging. "Then they need colors, paints, and crayons, because sometimes you can't say what you feel, but you can draw it." She reached for one of his papers and drew a quick house with a heart above it. "And stories, and cookies if possible." Alexander laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. "Cookies might be a stretch for the accountants, but I think we can try." Within weeks, the Carter Stone Foundation began to take shape. Meetings filled his calendar, not with brokers or lawyers, but with shelter directors and social workers. For the first time in his life, he found himself listening more than speaking. Amelia attended the sessions too, often climbing onto his lap halfway through, her presence disarming men who had once feared him across boardroom tables. When she spoke, they listened. At their first site visit, a children's shelter on the south side, Amelia stepped into the faded common room without hesitation. While Alexander shook hands with administrators, she knelt on the floor, emptying a bag of caps she had collected. The other children gathered, curious. "What are those?" one boy asked, his voice wary. "They're maps," Amelia said, spreading the caps into patterns. "Pick your favorite one, and it'll show you where your happy place is." Soon the floor was covered with shapes, stars, rivers, circles of hope built from discarded metal. Alexander stood back, watching as his daughter turned scraps into connection. She was doing what money alone could never buy, giving children the dignity of being seen. The realization nearly undid him. That night, as they rode home, Amelia pressed her forehead against the glass, watching the city lights blur below. "Did we help them, Daddy?" she asked quietly. He reached over, squeezing her hand. "Yes, and that was just the beginning." The next morning, he found her asleep, up at the table, crayons scattered around her, a new map half-finished under her hand. In the center sat the crimson cap, the ruby that had started everything. He lifted it gently, feeling its rough edges, and knew without question that the empire he was building now would outlast every skyscraper with his name etched in steel. It would be an empire of hope, and it had begun with a child's treasure map. Rain lashed against the penthouse windows that night, streaks of water blurring the view of the city into a smear of lights and shadows. Alexander stood alone in his study, the crimson bottle cap resting on his desk beside a stack of foundation documents. He should have felt triumphant. The Carter Stone Foundation was gaining momentum, its programs already transforming neglected shelters into places of color and laughter. But unease gnawed at him, sharp and insistent, like the hum of a storm waiting to break. It had started with whispers, a donor pulling out without explanation, a shipment of supplies delayed for weeks, papers misplaced that had never once been misplaced in his world. At first, he dismissed them as the growing pains of a new venture. But then the letter arrived, slipped under his office door without a name. Walk away or the truth comes out. The words were typed, but he could hear the voice behind them, Richard Blackwood. Once, they had been partners. Blackwood had been ambitious, cunning, the kind of man who thrived in Alexander's shadow. But greed had rotted him from the inside, twisting loyalty into resentment. Years ago, Alexander had cut him out of the company after uncovering embezzlement. Blackwood vanished from the city's elite, ruined, bitter, a snake nursing its venom. Now he had returned, striking at the one thing Alexander could not bear to lose. He poured a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid trembling in the glass as his hand shook with fury he hadn't felt in years. Blackwood's game was obvious: destroy the foundation, smear Alexander's name, strip him of credibility before he had even built this fragile, new empire of hope. And worse, use Amelia as a weapon. Already, rumors buzzed in financial circles, claims that Alexander had fabricated her connection, that the girl was nothing but a pawn to clean his image. The thought made his blood run cold. Amelia, who still arranged bottle caps on her windowsill before bed. Amelia, who carried her grandmother's shawl around the cavernous penthouse as though it stitched the rooms together. Amelia, who had asked him just last night if their maps could reach every child in the world. He could endure the loss of fortune, reputation, even safety, but not her trust. A knock at the study door startled him. He slid the threatening letter into a drawer and straightened. Amelia peeked in, her curls damp from her bath, wearing pajamas dotted with stars. She padded barefoot across the carpet, climbing onto his lap without asking. "Why do you look so serious?" she asked, peering up at him with wide eyes. He forced a smile. "Just thinking about work." "Don't think too much," she said wisely, pressing one of her bottle caps into his palm. "Here, this one's for courage. You'll need it." The innocence of her gift broke something in him. He held her close, inhaling the scent of soap in her hair, and silently vowed he would not let Blackwood's poison touch her. Later that week, his investigators confirmed what he had already suspected. The Bentley crash had not been an accident. The brake lines had been cut. The timing was too precise, the execution too clean. Blackwood had tried to erase him that day on the highway. If not for Amelia's courage, the plan would have succeeded. The revelation lit a fire in Alexander's chest that no storm could extinguish. The man who had once played games with billions was now playing with something far more dangerous, a father's love. And fathers, when threatened, became men capable of burning down empires to protect their children. As lightning split the sky outside, Alexander closed his hand around the bottle cap Amelia had given him. Courage. He whispered the word like a vow, his eyes burning with a resolve sharper than any blade. Blackwood. Ode thought he could undo what Amelia had built with her small hands and bright spirit. He was wrong. The storm outside raged, but in the penthouse study, a greater storm gathered, silent and fierce. Alexander Stone would not run. He would not yield. If Blackwood wanted war, he would find himself facing a man who had finally discovered what was worth fighting for. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and tension. Rows of spectators whispered behind their hands, journalists scribbled in frantic shorthand, and camera shutters clicked like restless insects. At the center of it all sat Alexander Stone, not as the titan of industry the world once feared, but as a father, his jaw set, his hand clenched around the small bottle cap Amelia had pressed into his palm that morning. He had promised her he would carry it, and he had sworn to himself it would see him through the fire. Across the aisle, Richard Blackwood lounged in his chair with a smirk that never reached his eyes. His suit was immaculate, his hair slicked back, but his gaze carried the smugness of a man convinced the game was already won. He had threatened to paint Alexander as a fraud, a manipulator hiding behind a child's innocence to launder his reputation. He had allies in the shadows, men who owed him favors, men willing to whisper lies into microphones. But Blackwood had underestimated something that could never be bought, the truth. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically, audio recordings captured in hushed meetings where Blackwood's voice spilled poison, cut the lines, make it look like an accident, the world won't miss him. Each word echoed through the courtroom, striking like a hammer. Gasps rippled across the gallery, and for the first time, Blackwood's smirk faltered. Alexander's heart pounded, not for himself, but for the little girl who sat quietly at the back beside Mrs. Rivera, her grandmother's shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Amelia's wide eyes took everything in, too young for such a battlefield, yet unflinching, as if she knew this was her fight too. When it was Alexander's turn to speak, he rose slowly. He had delivered countless speeches in boardrooms and ballrooms, commanding the attention of men who measured time in millions. But this was different. His voice carried not the weight of power, but the weight of a father's promise. "I built towers of steel and glass," he began, his voice steady, "but I discovered their foundations meant nothing when tested by fire. I thought wealth could protect me, but it was not money that saved my life. It was a child, a 7-year-old girl who saw a man in need and risked everything to pull him from the flames." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before finding Amelia's face. "That child is my daughter. She carries her mother's courage and a heart that refuses to see despair where hope can be made. I did not know she existed until fate tore the veil away. But now that I do, I will not let lies, nor threats, nor shadows take her from me." The silence that followed was profound, the kind that pressed into the skin. Blackwood shifted in his seat, his mask of control cracking. The jury watched him with eyes no longer clouded by his charm. The judge's gavel finally struck, but Alexander barely heard the formalities. What mattered was the shuffling of agents moving toward Blackwood, the clink of handcuffs snapping shut, and the realization that the venomous chapter was closing. As Alexander turned, Amelia broke free from Mrs. Rivera's side and ran to him. She collided into his chest with a force that nearly knocked the wind out of him, her small arms wrapping tight around his neck. Her voice was muffled against his shirt. "You're not leaving me, are you?" He dropped to one knee, clutching her as if she were the only anchor left in the world. His eyes burned, his voice rough with emotion. "Never. Fathers stay." She leaned back, her eyes shining, and lifted the crimson bottle cap keychain she had carried into the courtroom. Holding it high as though it were a trophy, she whispered, "We won, Daddy. Our treasure map worked." And for the first time in his life, Alexander Stone felt what victory truly meant. Not applause, not headlines, not fortune. It was the steady beat of a child's heart against his own, the promise of presence, and the truth that no storm could ever take from them. The gala hall shimmered under crystal chandeliers, but Alexander hardly noticed the grandeur. His focus was on the small hand clutching his as they stepped into the room together. Amelia wore a simple ivory dress with a blue ribbon at the waist, her curls pinned back with the same care she had once used to arrange bottle caps on the porch. Around them, Chicago's elite turned their heads, whispers sparking like firecrackers as the billionaire and the little girl walked side by side toward a stage lined with children's artwork. The Carter Stone Foundation's first anniversary was more than an event. It was a testament, a declaration carved out of grief and rebuilt with love. Paintings from shelters across the country filled the walls, each one telling stories of resilience, of children who had found color again where once there had only been gray. And in the center of it all hung Amelia's masterpiece, a heart-shaped mosaic of bottle caps, each donated by a child the foundation had helped. Reporters angled for the perfect shot, lenses snapping as Alexander lifted Amelia onto the stage. She didn't flinch under the lights. Her gaze swept the crowd with the same steady boldness she had shown the day she faced down the flames. A murmur passed through the audience. Something about her presence silenced even the most hardened executives. "My grandma used to say," Amelia began, her voice clear though small, "that everyone carries treasure inside them. Sometimes it gets buried under sadness or fear, but it's always there. All we need is someone to help us find it." She lifted her red bottle cap keychain, and the light caught it like a ruby. "This was my treasure. It helped me believe something good was coming when everything felt scary, and it brought me to my dad." Alexander's throat tightened. He had spoken to rooms filled with presidents, bankers, and kings, but nothing compared to the wisdom of a child who had lost so much and still chose hope. Amelia turned, her small hand finding his. "We made this foundation so other kids won't feel alone, but tonight, I want to tell you a secret." She paused, letting the silence stretch, her eyes scanning the hall. "My daddy didn't just find me, he saved me too. And now we save each other." The applause was thunderous, but Alexander barely heard it. His heart ached with pride, with gratitude, with a love so fierce it made the room blur. For years he had measured success in quarterly reports and profit margins, yet none of it mattered in this moment. What mattered was the child who had crawled through fire to pull him into a second chance at life. Later, as the gala wound down and guests filtered away, Alexander stood with Amelia at the edge of the gallery. They gazed at her mosaic, the bottle caps forming not just a heart, but a map, lines weaving outward like roads toward unseen destinations. "Do you see it, Daddy?" she asked softly. "See what, sweetheart?" "It's not just a heart, it's a path. Grandma always told me treasure maps don't just show where the treasure is, they show where you need to go next." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "This is our map, for all the kids still waiting." Alexander swallowed hard, lifting her into his arms. In her words, "EM." He heard the echo of Rebecca's laughter, the quiet strength of Mabel's love, and the promise of a future he had once thought impossible. The reveal was not that Amelia was his daughter, that truth had already reshaped his world. The real revelation was that she was his compass, his purpose, the piece of himself he hadn't known was missing until fate put her in his path. As they left the hall, the city lights stretching like stars across the skyline, Amelia leaned her head against his shoulder. "We'll follow the map together, right?" "Always," Alexander whispered, his voice breaking as he kissed the top of her head. "Wherever it leads." And with that, father and daughter stepped into a future drawn not in steel or fortune, but in bottle caps, treasure maps, and a love that nothing, not fire, not lies, not loss, could ever extinguish.